Alrighty folks, what's going on? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking about DSLR video settings, how to shoot video with your DSLR camera, and some tips and tricks that I've learned along the way. So we're going to talk about your frame rate, what that means, and how to mess with it and what it does for you. We're going to talk about your shutter speed and sort of the rules of using your shutter speed for video. We're also going to talk about aperture and ISO, how that all plays together, and things to be aware of. So let's get into it, shall we? So the first thing we need to talk about is your frame rate. So your frame rate is known as your FPS, or your frames per second. That is essentially how many photos your camera is taking within 1 second of video footage. So the standard in North America is 24 frames a second, or more accurately, 23.976 frames a second. You would use that for something like this, something where you're having, maybe you have a talking head, you're doing an interview, or you're shooting really anything where you want the motion of that video to be what your eyeball sees, essentially. Depending on the camera that you have, you might also have options to shoot in 60 frames a second or 120 frames a second, kind of like a nugget to remember. The higher the frame rate, the slower the motion. So the higher frame rates are used more for more crafty types of artsy shots and stuff like that. For me, I use them for B-roll. It makes everything look a little bit more cinematic, a little bit more professional. But you know, there's a time and place, so choose wisely. Second thing we need to talk about is your shutter speed. So your shutter speed is arguably the most important thing that you need to keep in mind when shooting video on your DSLR. It's sort of what determines the look of your video. What I mean by that is the motion blur. So basically, what you're trying to do is you're trying to replicate the way that your human eyeballs see motion, right? So the rule of thumb with that is always make sure your shutter speed is double your frame rate. So example, I'm shooting this in 24 frames a second, so that means that my shutter speed is 50. I know accurately double my frame rate would be 48, but the closest I've got is 50, and it does the job just fine. So that rule also applies when you're shooting at higher frame rates. So say you're shooting at 60 frames a second, for an example, your shutter speed is now going to be 120. So math, but it really helps the flow of your video. It helps the look and feel. Everything looks a lot more natural and a lot more cinematic. So one thing you need to remember when it comes to messing with your shutter speed, the faster you make your shutter speed, the less light is gonna come in. Just remember that if you're trying to shoot slow motion in an environment where the lighting is low, or you can't really control it, or it's just kind of shit, remember that you're gonna be introducing a lot more noise to get that shutter speed right. Make sense? Next thing on the list is your aperture. All the rules from photography still apply when it comes to your aperture. The wider open it is, the more light's being let in, the shallower depth of field, all of these things. If you're trying to shoot with your aperture wide open, you're gonna run into some problems if you have a lot of light coming in with your shutter speed. You see where I'm going with this? For example, I was on the beach not too long ago and I was shooting just like a fun little video with my friends, and I wanted to keep my aperture as open as could be so that I could get as much depth of field as possible. Problem was, I was shooting in 24 frames a second with my shutter speed at 50, so that means that a lot of light is being let into the camera. So there are a few things that you can do to kind of fix that or avoid that problem. The first one being get a neutral density filter. Basically what your ND filter will do is essentially put sunglasses on your lens so that you don't have to change your shutter speed, you don't have to change your ISO. You can literally just darken it and lighten it as you go. So that's the best #1 tip to keep all your settings where they need to be and still shoot in a bright environment. The second thing would just be to control your lighting. I know it's not always possible. Example, you're on the beach, what are you gonna do? Say, sun, can you please turn it down? No, it's not gonna happen. If you can, always try to control your lighting. If it's not an option, ND filter for sure. And then last but not least, worst case scenario, if you have no ND filter and you have no way of controlling your light, then best you can do is just bring down that aperture. My example, like I just said, when I was on the beach, I forgot my ND filter like a noob, and all of my shots were shot in I think f/22 or something crazy like that. It did the job, but I did sacrifice a little bit of that depth of field. So the only other thing left to talk about now is your ISO. Kind of like your aperture, it all kind of works the same. The standard rules still apply. The lower the ISO, the less noisy your footage is gonna be. When it comes to run and gun video shooting, for the most part, I will let my ISO kind of do its thing. I'll set it to auto and see what it looks like, and if it's going crazy, then obviously I'll figure it out. But if it's doing a decent job, I'll let it kind of keep going and do what it's gotta do. Everything is always better when you can control your lighting and when you have complete control over your environment. But if you don't, just be mindful of it. And like I said, when it comes to shooting slow motion or anything in a higher frame rate, just be wary of that ISO. Maybe don't let it wander past a certain point, because it will start to introduce a lot of noise and you could end up with unusable footage. Also be mindful of the camera that you have. Some cameras have better ISO performance than others, so that's also something to factor in. So that's about it. If you like this video, give it a big thumbs up. If you hated this video, give it a big thumbs down. And if you wanna see more of these videos, hit subscribe. I will be back for more. And if you have any suggestions, anything that you wanna learn desperately and you're keen for a tutorial or whatever it might be, let me know in the comments. I'm collecting some information and trying to figure out my next few videos. So let me know. So that's about it. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.